Yeah,
You want to remind folks about the Recovery Walk next weekend?
it's this weekend, isn't it?
Yeah, this weekend.
Yeah, it's Saturday. So there's that walk this Saturday. Is it 12 to 4 maybe? 1 to 4. Me and at Walgreens walking to Nunley, I think. I actually won't be there, but I think as many people should go as possible. I think a lot of people from like Vita and stuff are going, right?
The Wonderland.
It's to Wonderland? Okay. This next Monday is going to be our first Monday night meeting. It's going to be at Journey Church. I know for a fact the males will be there. Is there any chance we have a female facilitator for a week? Maybe we can rotate out. Until we have a female facilitator, I can't tell females to fill up. So come, no? Okay. Maybe think about that amongst yourselves in your step study. Maybe you guys can work out a rotating schedule so that way the girls can have another meeting. I'm a very grateful believer in Jesus Christ. I've been set free from my addiction, but I struggle with pride, jealousy, anger, and I too get nervous when I'm up here. My name is Matt.
Hi, Matt.
So every year when I grab this coin, I do my testimonies. It's been 1 year since I've done it here. Okay. So my earliest memory I can recall is my mother and father, they both fighting over me. They're grasping, trying to see which one was going to take me. After that, my father proceeded to try to drown my mom in the kitchen sink until one of my uncles came to stop him. I must have been like 3 years old. I only have a few memories like that of my father, and I think the only reason I remember them is because they're kind of traumatic. I later on shared like some of my memories with my mom, and she told me that they didn't even happen. So I guess a lot of my childhood, I was like using dreams as my memories, so they'd be more. It I don't know, make me feel better about when I was little. My father died shortly after from a drunk driving accident. I was 5 years old. I can recall the pastor of his church coming to try to console me and my little sister. That same year, my grandfather died and my grandma was murdered by arson. It felt like everything that reminded me of my father was taken away from me in that year. I remember being confused, heartbroken, very, very angry at my mother. I blamed her for my father not being around. After his death, I was always a little socially awkward, and I feel that was because I never had a strong male role model to teach me how to act or be a man. I always felt like I didn't measure up. I felt that way in everything I did, which made me not even really ever try to accomplish anything because I secretly thought I was going to fail anyways. My mother was an alcoholic, and she met my stepfather when I was about 10 years old. I did not like the fact that my mother's attention was going to someone else, so I began acting out at home, and it did not take long for me and my stepfather to not see eye to eye. Meanwhile, my mother started spending more and more time with him and less time with me. So I was jealous. I was already insecure, so I really just began getting in trouble at this point. Any kind of attention was better than no attention. My school years were normally short because I was always expelled or suspended. When I finally finished my high school career, I had 3 credits, and I think they were all gym. And I'm not joking. In the beginning, I would get grounded for a long time. After a while, I would only be grounded while I was suspended. And then my mom was so tired of me, she didn't even ground me anymore. She'd just be like, get out of the house. It's about the time that was about in my teen years, and I started hanging out with the older kids around the neighborhood, the other ones that weren't in school. I was trying to fit in, and I did anything to try fitting into that gang lifestyle. I basically became a little drug runner in the neighborhood, and I would deliver packages because it would give me positive attention, and it would keep me high in the process that the older kids would. Drugs and alcohol made me feel comfortable, just like so many people say. I felt good in my own skin, so naturally I wanted to do them more and more to escape reality. They made me feel more confident, like I could accomplish anything, so I used any chance I had. Eventually later in my teen years, I was living that drug dealing lifestyle just because it was the only way that I ever felt needed. I rarely spent time at home. I lived at friends' houses as much as their parents would allow me, and I was just trying to escape my home life because it seemed more and more like my mom, my sister, and my stepdad had a family, and I was just an outcast. this just added to my insecurities and feelings of inadequacy. Eventually, one time after me and my stepfather got into a fight, he told my mom to pick either him or me, and she picked him. I was told that I was getting sent to Alaska to live with my uncle and his family. I thought I wouldn't get in trouble up here because I'm all the way up in Alaska. Things didn't get any better though. I ended up getting in trouble in Anchorage in like the first 3 months I was there, and I was facing some like pretty serious charges. I would have did like at least 5 years. But I had a family member that was in the Senate, and he told me he could make it all go away, but I had to go and live in the family cabins up in Talkeetna. So I went to the cabins in Talkeetna. But I was like a little city boy, and it was Talkeetna, and we're talking Talkeetna like 20 years ago, and it wasn't even downtown Talkeetna. So I had everything I needed, but there was no one around, ever. I mean, like, summertime people would be visiting, but wintertime, I was by myself. So being alone made me feel like I was cast aside again, and I eventually... Oh, I missed something. So this was a very lonely time, and the worst part about this time is this is when my addiction actually started, because it's when I started drinking by myself. Eventually, I moved to Wasilla and began that party lifestyle. I was probably about 21 when I moved here. And this is when partying was still fun at this point. I worked every moment I had off, I spent getting high, and I instantly fell into the wrong crowds again. Part of the problem was my whole entire life, I had no positive male role models, and the people I looked up to were like drug dealers and rappers. And so that was the lifestyle I wanted to have even in my 20s. Pretty much I was raised by Tupac and Snoop Dogg and their lyrics and how to, it's no wonder none of my relationships worked, because I treated women by how they told me to treat women in those songs. Anyways, where did we before we met? Okay, eventually I met a girl, and I kind of started to settle down. I bought my first home, and we had a kid. For the first time, I thought I was actually going to have a family, but I was unwilling to give up drugs and alcohol. And I did not know how to show love, since this was never anything I witnessed growing up. I treated her very poorly, and then eventually, when my child was 2 years old and I was in Washington, I got a call saying that she married someone else and moved out of state. And it didn't even seem real at the time. My heart was in my throat all of a sudden, and I did not want to believe the news I was hearing. I caught the first flight to Alaska and went to my child's daycare and asked if my daughter had been there, and they said they haven't seen her in a week. I instantly fell to my knees crying. Once again, I was alone. And this was a bad time. This just added to my abandonment issues and reinforced the idea that anything I ever cared about would eventually discard me and leave me. And my addiction, this is when it started blowing up out of control. It should have sunk into my head that my kid's mother would rather marry someone else and leave and steal my kid than be around me, because she was scared of me. She thought she was scared of what I would do if she tries taking my kid from me. So I was doing drugs every single day. At this point, I was just trying to numb the pain I was feeling. I would begin my day with meth, coke, and pills, and wash it down with a fifth, sometimes maybe more. And I lived this way for a year, and there was lots of other drugs in between. I went back to drug dealing because it was the only way that I ever felt needed, and I so badly needed to feel needed at that time. I'm lucky I did not die, because that year I overdosed multiple times, and almost nightly I would drink to the point where I blacked out. I dreaded every day when I'd wake up on the weekends, when I'd stumble and look at my wallet and see how much money I spent, or if I had my phone, or what I did that weekend, because there was always something. Shortly after this, I met my wife. I don't know where she went. Oh, you're right there. But anyways, and I was crazy in love with her from that day, but even that love cannot stop my life from spiraling out of control. I eventually got hooked on opiates, and I wouldn't do anything if I didn't have them. I wouldn't go to work if I didn't have it. I wouldn't go to my kid's baseball game if I didn't have it. And I wouldn't even get out of bed if I couldn't feed that monster living inside me. even though I thought I was in control of my addiction, this is about the point where I had absolutely no control and it had total control over me. She unknowingly enabled me by slowly starting to pay more and more bills as I lost my job. She helped me detox a couple of times, but then I went right back to use. Because I wasn't doing it for the right reasons. I was doing it to try to appease her at the time. I wasn't ready. I put way too much on her during this time, and I wasn't keeping up with the house payment, so we got the news that our house was sold and we had to move out within a month. The worst part about this was she was pregnant with my twins because we just went through the in vitro process. We moved a couple of times over the next year because I was no help at all, and I left all financial responsibilities on her. These are some things I'm most ashamed about in my life. I was gone more and more because my pill addiction became a full-blown heroin addiction at this point, and my every thought was consumed with my drug use. I was probably about 28, 30, I don't know. Yeah, 28. I did many horrible things during this time, and I used my business to rip people off. I was involved in many violent crimes. I ran with God knows who, for God knows what reasons, and a lot of the times it's just a blur and it doesn't even feel real. At one point, I remember getting surrounded at Holiday, like 10 cops pinned me in, and they asked me who the person in the passenger seat was, and I literally did not even know this guy's name, and I've been rolling around with him for like a week, and it's just because we were helping each other out at the time. I was out of control. I stole my kid's Xbox at one point, which is probably one of the things I'm most ashamed of through all this. I was dishonest. I broke every promise I ever made, and I left my family worrying about me constant nights when I would not call and would not come home sometimes for weeks at a time. When my children were born at the hospital, I ran out of drugs, so I told her I needed to go get clothes, and I went to Wasilla. In the process, I missed my twins' birth. I remember seeing on Facebook that they were born, and I remember thinking, well, I'm already here. I might as well finish going through what I'm doing and get high. It didn't even, I don't know. It should have clicked to me. No one even called me to tell my kids were born. They were just like, what? He's just a piece of shit anyway. So being addicted to heroin is like being a slave. It makes you do things you never thought were possible, all because you don't want to get sick. Looking back at this time, it's like a bad dream, and it's hard to believe the person I'm talking about is me sometimes. Getting high was not fun anymore, but it was way past the stopping point, and I eventually did something I never thought I would do, which is become an IV drug user. I began using meth to get off heroin, and this was not a good idea, and it just opened another door to the insanity I was feeling inside myself. I was up for weeks at a time. The thoughts I were having were absolutely insane. I would see things that weren't there, and I'd make up scenarios that weren't happening. I'm lucky I didn't kill anyone during this time because there was many times I almost did. One night when my wife did not want to sleep with me, I proceeded to pull her off the bed with plans of forcing her. My twins that she was caring for were not even 2 feet away sleeping. I did not go through with it, but from this point on, all trust in our relationship was broken, and my wife was scared of me. One night, in my anger and yelling, it caused the cops to get called by my stepdaughter, and I went to jail and became trespassed from our property. At the time, this felt absolutely crushing, but this was actually a blessing that God put in place because my wife would have never kicked me out. She would have never told me that I could not come there, and I would have never got better, honestly. So I proceeded to go to jail over and over because I kept trying to go back to the house. I even kicked in the door. I even punched my cousin in the face with my kids sitting right there. And I put my family through hell during this time. I was a little boy who blamed all of my problems on my dad not being around and my mom being an alcoholic. But there I was doing things worse than they ever did. And my kids were witnessing everything firsthand. I was an absolute monster. Finally, after going to prison for I don't even know how many times on domestic violence charges, I was absolutely broken and I was defeated, and I thought for sure that everything I cared for was lost. After all, I did horrible things to my wife and my kids. There was no way that there was no way they even should wait for me. That time in jail, though, something was different. I was in such a broken state that instead of like watching TV and playing cards, something was telling me to read the Bible. I got one of those New Testament Bibles that pastors give you when they come to visit. And I spent countless other times in jail, and I read tons of books, and I figured, what do I have to lose? I talked to a cellmate who I knew from before, and I asked him if I would gain anything if I read this, and he told me I would find everything that I ever need. That has stuck with me since that day, and I just began reading the Bible. I didn't understand it, but I just kept reading. Eventually, I got sent out to Goose Creek, and I began talking to this guy that was handcuffed to me on the bus. Even though he had a bunch of charges that I would not normally hang out with someone for, he spent a ton of time in church, and he was a missionary in Nepal for a year. Me and him began praying together, and I would walk over to his cell and talk to him about my curiosities about God, and he would kind of just tell me his everything he knew. We eventually got moved to a different mod, and there was a turning point in my life where I had the opportunity to be cellies with this guy that I just met, or a friend of mine that I'd known for like 10 years, and I chose this guy. In that, this was like one of those Y's in the road where I actually went the opposite way that I would normally go. And then something, from that moment on, like that rest of that time in jail was just kind of like, he was just mentoring me. He even though he had all this stuff, he had so much knowledge of the Bible that he would just tell me stories. And because back then I didn't understand it. When I read it, it's foreign unless you're saved, because you need the Holy Spirit to help you to kind of read it. I went to church services and spent night with my cellmate talking about God. I was still heartbroken over my wife and kids, but he kept telling me to give it to God. I did not know what give it to God meant or how to do it, so I thought he was completely crazy. After all, how could I give my problems to something I cannot see and something that is outside of myself, or trust something outside of myself to handle them? One night I was at a church service. The churches out there are massive. There was like 200 inmates, and I was sitting in the back because I felt out of place, and I quietly was singing along to the worship music, when for some reason the guy who was singing in the front caught my attention. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, and in my mind I thought, this guy really isn't very good at singing. At that moment it just clicked. He was screaming in front of hundreds of inmates, something I would be absolutely petrified to do, and he didn't give no care to what any of us thought. He was only concerned about praising God. And for some reason in that moment everything just clicked, and I felt a rush come over me, and the lights, they got brighter. And they were suddenly putting off heat, and they were radiating right down on me. Mixed with tears that I've been fighting that whole night, almost blinded me, and I felt the sensation come over me that was more intense than any drug. I felt higher than I've ever felt before in that moment, and I opened my heart and accepted Christ as my Savior. After that service was over, there was a guy who was sitting down the row from me, like 4 or 5 seats, and he walked up to me and he said, "That was pretty intense." And I was like, "What was?" And he's like, I felt that energy coming off of you during that service. It's crazy. Okay, it's the feeling that the Holy Spirit, when it comes over you the first time, is insane, by the way. When you're living in darkness and you finally see the light. I later started to call drugs Satan's cheap imitation of the feeling that the Holy Spirit gives you. Satan uses drugs and alcohol to take you to hell, and it's disguised as heaven. It's kind of like what we were talking about in the devotional earlier. Before going to prison that time, I did not believe in God, and I used to spend my nights up arguing against him, saying science disproved him. Oh, did I just skip a page? Yeah. I went to church services and spent... No, I did skip a page. Hold on. Oh, okay. I don't know what I did there. We might be skipping a lot here. So in that moment, I felt like Jesus, or I felt like the scales came off my eyes, and I could finally see for the first time like Paul. This was my first surrender to God. I finally gave into the situation with my wife, and I remember falling to my knees and crying out, "This is out of my control, Father. I'm giving this to you." I wrote a letter to my wife apologizing for everything I'd ever done, and that I would understand if she just moved on and found someone who could make her happy, and that I was going to treatment, and maybe someday I could be part of my kids' lives. I remember 2 weeks later, the CO brought me a letter, and it read, when I read it, it said that she loved me, and the only thing she ever wanted was for me to get better so we could be a family. At this point, I was sobbing bitterly. I was like probably snot slobbering, crying. I was so happy that there was a chance I could still have my family, because throughout my whole life, the reoccurring factor is loss. Like everything I've ever cared about has went away. Jesus came and saved me in that cell. He also gave me experience of being saved that I cannot doubt, because it's something I could never deny. There was no maybe I was saved. I was once told, sinners don't seek God, God seeks sinners, and that's exactly what he did for me. Mark 2:17, and hearing this, Jesus said to them, it is not those who are healthy that need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. I wasn't looking for God. I didn't even believe in him, but nonetheless, he believed in me and loved me and rescued me at a time in my life when I was absolutely broken. I was baptized in prison and was released about a month later. I went to treatment when I got out, but I was so excited to be reunited with my family. I got out after 3 months and went and lived with them, even though I was still breaking a protective order at that point, and I was risking going back to jail again for domestic violence again, or trespassing, or whatever it was. I began working, and this mistake so many of us do, and I just started working like 60 hours a week, stopped practicing my faith, and problems started resurfacing in my marriage. I even at one point thought I could handle drinking, which is absolutely insane. My wife wasn't happy with the fact that I was using again, so I moved into my own place. She told me that I never did anything I said I was going to do all the way, so I decided to put myself back into treatment. I was going to prove her I could finish something, and this was the second time I surrendered to God. This time, I knew that I had to build a solid foundation and make recovery a permanent part of my life. Slowly, I cut out all the unhealthy relationships that I had in my life, and I basically had no friends, but I always had my relationship with Jesus, and I always felt his presence. Rick Warren said, real security can only be found in that which can never be taken away from us, your relationship with God. Once again, I was working on my relationship with God. I completed treatment, and I even stayed twice as long as they recommended when I started. I became very close with one of my counselors, and today he's one of my closest friends and spiritual sponsors. My wife and I reconnected once again, and after a short amount of time, my old counselor recommended that I apply for this new peer support program that they were starting. Up until that point, I never considered working in the recovery field, but since I thought very highly of this guy, I went ahead and applied, only to get turned down and not get the job. But this lit a fire under me, and it made me realize this was something I wanted. So I quit my job on faith and began getting involved in recovery. I volunteered at the treatment center that I went through, and I started applying at different places that were available at the time. At this time, my mom got really sick with cirrhosis of the liver from her drinking, and I went down to say goodbye to her on her deathbed. My mom was already out of it when I got there, but I'm still grateful that she got to see me, and this was the first time she's probably seen me sober since I was 13 years old. I watched my mom die slowly from cirrhosis, and this just reinforced my own sobriety, because it is absolutely miserable watching someone die from cirrhosis. They stop healing, and their wounds drain, and she didn't even know my name, and it was absolutely horrible. When I got back, my stepfather sent me I got a check in the mail for $5,000, and he said that my grandma, when she died, gave them money, and they gave some to my sister, but they wouldn't give it to me because I would spend it on drugs. He said he was proud of the man I was becoming and wanted me to have this money. The crazy thing is that this was the first time I could ever recall anyone telling me they were proud of me about anything. I was in my 30s, and I finally heard the words I've longed to hear my whole life. That money helped me pay the bills so that I could spend that summer focusing on my recovery and trying to switch careers. It just shows that God had my back in this and wanted this change to happen, because without that, I don't know if I could have taken that time to focus on getting a new job, and it might have ended up never happening. After what felt like forever, I got an interview at the same place where I work today, and since then I eat, sleep, and think recovery 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. God has given me a life that I never thought was possible. With my job, I have attended just about every type of recovery event that you could possibly imagine, but none of them ever felt quite right to me. I didn't care for the other big recovery meetings because the fact that they did not say that their higher power was Jesus Christ, and that bothered me. Still bothers me. After all, I had my spiritual awakening long before I ever worked steps. So I knew in my heart that all credit goes to God and God alone. I found Celebrate Recovery that summer, and I took off and started focusing on my recovery and getting in the recovery field. I instantly knew that out of all the meetings I've ever been to, this was the one for me. One where I could openly say my Savior was Jesus Christ and proclaim how I owe my whole entire recovery to Him. I found my home. I have been attending Celebrate Recovery since 2018 and have been at this one since 2019. I've completed 2 step studies and plan on being involved in the one that starts in about a month. The relationships that I've built through those last couple years, especially the ones in the step studies, have been a huge factor on the increased quality of my life. You can't help but build strong ties with people when you sit in a group with them for 6 to 9 months and share your deepest, darkest secrets. By the time you're done, those people in that step study probably know more about you than your family or your closest friends. God has worked miracles in my life, and the biggest one is my recovery. He has brought healing to my marriage and has even put my wife's heart to attending to Celebrate Recovery. That's kind of old. She has been working. She just actually is almost done with her first step study now, and has also made strong friendships there. And I'm proud of her, and I'm so grateful for God, because there was like 2 years ago when I came here, and this was just causing more separation, like more time away, and it was just another fight. Like, you could leave it on for Thursday, you know what I mean, and something else away from my family. So with God bringing her here with me is like my prayers are answered. I have to say how incredibly grateful I am for my lovely wife. She has stuck by my side through ups and downs and dealt with things that she never should have dealt with. But she never gave up on me, even when everyone else did. Without her, I wouldn't be the man I am today, and I definitely wouldn't have my recovery, because in the beginning, when I didn't care enough about myself to get sober for me, I got sober for her and my kids. And I'm forever in her debt. Remember, God can take what Satan meant for evil and use it for good, and that's exactly what he did with me. Genesis 50:20, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done. I'm grateful that I became an IV drug user, as crazy as that sounds, because that's what it took to break me. I finally looked outside myself for an answer and started looking up. And it took me getting to my absolute bottom and finding a level of brokenness that God could finally begin to use me. I look back at that last time in jail with fondness also, because I have never been able to focus on my relationship with God like I did that time. God has brought healing in my life and given me wholeness. He's given me a family, and I finally don't feel alone. That scared little fat kid who never felt adequate has something he's never had before, a feeling of being loved. Another crazy thing was a couple of months ago when I was granted my chaplainship, and I was able to go into the jail, which I've only went once. When I went out to Palmer, I ran into that cellmate of mine, that one that helped me so much in my very beginning of my journey. I should have never been granted my chaplaincy because I haven't been off paper long enough. And the fact that I ran into him when he's been a thought on my mind for a very long time, like whatever happened with him, only God could have orchestrated that and made that possible. Proverbs 16:9, a man's mind plans his way, has he journeyed through life, but the Lord directs his steps and establishes them. I have people in my life today that are there with no strings attached, no ulterior motives. They just want what's best for me, and they do not want anything in return. That's something I never had before. Every relationship that I ever had was based on reciprocity, which is what can we do for each other. That's not how it is here at CR. Once you come, you're part of the family, so settle in, find a sponsor, and one day when you're ready, join a step study and experience the healing that only Jesus Christ can give you. 1 Peter 2:24, he personally carried our sins in his body on the cross so that we can be dead to sin and live for righteousness. By his wounds you are healed. After all, he took that kid that always looked up to drug dealers, never graduated high school, and never felt like I was good enough for anything, and made it possible for me to get my GED in jail. I've just about every certification for chemical dependency and behavioral health that I can get, and I've got my last 2 years of college paid for on scholarships. I barely went to school as a kid, and I have to work 10 times harder than everyone else in there, but I have never gotten anything less than an A. I have an awesome job that I get to help those in recovery and minister to them while assisting them to learn how to live a sober life again. Deuteronomy 2:7, for the Lord your God has blessed you in all that you have done. He has known your wanderings through his great wilderness. I mean, what kind of dream is that? And I'm also not trying to brag about this. This is something that all glory goes to God. There's no way that any of this would have ever happened without him. I've been set free from my drug addictions, but I still have to continue to work on myself at bettering my marriage, working on my relationships with my kids and everyone else, because I still have problems in just about every single area. I just don't struggle with drugs or alcohol today. Being of service is one of the biggest joys that I've ever felt in my whole entire life, and it's a vital step in maintaining my recovery. The only thing you have to change is everything. After all, or for most of my life, I was very selfish, so it's about time I start thinking about someone else. Proverbs 19:17, one who is gracious to a poor man lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his good deed. Everyone has a giant hole inside them and tries to fill it with something, whether it's drugs, alcohol, sex, cars, whatever it is. And through trial and error, I finally realized that that hole is a God-sized hole, and the only thing you can fill it with is a relationship with Jesus Christ. God has given me everything and more that I was praying for while being stuck alone in that jail cell, or lonely nights getting high alone in a camper. And he gave me everything that I ever wanted and more. And he has given me purpose, and I owe every aspect of my life and recovery to him. That's it.